Okay, order. Good afternoon, members. Welcome you to this afternoon's meeting of the Northern Ireland Assembly Public Accounts Committee. And I would just confirm that we are now in public session. And we have a quorum, and so we'll now proceed to conduct today's business. Members, I need to tell you that mobile phones must be set to airplane mode or turned off. It's not sufficient to put mobiles on silent mode as they continue to interfere with the Assembly recording. The session has been recorded in video and audio and can be accessed via live online streaming either on the Northern Ireland Assembly website or Democracy Live. Any apologies this afternoon? Nope. Agenda item 2 then is the minutes of the 3rd of June, pages 9 to 14. Are members content that I sign these as being accurate? Okay. Thank you. Right. Declarations of interest. At meetings, members are required to register a relevant financial or other interest in register of members' interest. Does any member have any interest they wish to declare this afternoon? Thank you. Matters arising, I'm not aware of any. Agenda item 5 then, correspondence. There aren't any matters to be addressed in correspondence. So members, with your permission now, we will go into closed session for this agenda item and then go back into open session for items 7, 8 and 9. Can we please bring in Mr Stuart Stevenson of the TOA? The witnesses today appearing for us in person will be taken between agenda items to wipe down the table and prepare the next session in accordance with COVID regulations. So therefore there will have to be a necessity of short break in between sessions. Agreed?
Agreed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber.
Order. At this stage I'd like to welcome Mr Brennan, the Permanent Secretary and Accounting Officer for the Department of the Economy, Mr Richard Rogers, Head of Energy Group, and Mr Trevor McBride, Principal Officer, Renewable Electricity, to the meeting to brief the committee on their analysis of the Kpmg report. Also in attendance this afternoon, we're joined by Mr Kieran Donnelly, CB, Comptroller and Auditor General of the Northern Ireland Audit Office, Mr Stuart Stevenson, Treasury Officer of Accounts, Department of Finance, who's joining the meeting remotely. Members, in your pack are witness biographies 27-28, Northern Ireland Audit Office Generating Electricity, Renewable Energy, pages 29 to 108 of your pack. The Kpmg, an economic review of small scale wind, pages 109 of your pack. Correspondence dated 8th of June from Mike Brennan, including the analysis of Kpmg report, pages 157 to 171 of your pack, and the Northern Ireland Audit Office key points from Kpmg analysis at pages 172 of your pack. Correspondence dated the 14th of April in your table pack from Mr Brennan regarding information requested in the Department's evidence session on the 18th of March 2021. Mr Brennan, I would welcome you to the meeting, and at this stage invite you to make an opening statement, and then members will have comment and question. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very brief introduction from me. Obviously, following our last session with your committee on the 18th of March, there has been a lot of work, a lot of analysis undertaken. As I say, on the 18th of March, we discussed at length the Kpmg report, so lots of analysis undertaken since then to try and determine how robust that report was, and the narrow assurance and risk management group, which constitutes the department, the utility regulator and Ofgem, have been looking at that in detail, and we've provided you with a summary assessment of that piece of work. In addition to the Kpmg work, you will see that the risk management group, the assurance and risk management group, have also been doing some sort of benchmarking exercise as well, and Trevor, Richard and myself will hopefully take you through some of the key issues there.
Okay. Mr McBride, anything you want to add before we move to questions?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. Many members want to ask questions of Mr Brennan and Mr Rogers, Mr McBride. Any questions? Mr Muir.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming along here today in person, so it's useful. I note all your responses to the Kpmg report, and I read over that last night. Do you not think this highlights maybe the very heavy reliance upon the industry, and there's probably an over level of trust in terms of the figures that they provide, because if at the outset of this scheme there was a requirement for them to provide the information which you've been unable to get, so I don't think that would have been able to engender a lot more confidence and public trust in the scheme.
It's a delicate line to tread here. I know the point you're making, and it is a very, very valid one in terms of seeking complete transparency to give comfort, but at the same time, these are commercial contracts, and there is a necessity to protect, the commercial viability of the companies and their contracts that they have. So I do take reassurance from the Kpmg and the steering group findings in terms of the sample work that they did do. So obviously they didn't get into detailed invoice scrutiny for every single turbine, but the sampling that they did do does give a higher degree of assurance. But yes, I understand the point you're making, and it's maybe something that we look forward to. As we look forward to future schemes, that in terms of the obligations that we impose on the companies in terms of the data that they would provide to the utility regulator, Ofgem, and ourselves, we should have a greater degree of transparency than we do under this current scheme. Sir Richard or Trevor?
That's the fair point, yeah.
Yeah, it's just I understand that commercial element. I just don't know whether I'm sitting here fully assured that there's a full acceptance of the need to actually get access to that information. And many examples where government, this is not grant funding, it's separate, okay, but in many other examples where government are doing grant funding, there is a requirement to have access to that commercial information, and that information is provided because there's a financial incentive to provide it, and also it's a government body which is being provided to, so it's under a clear basis upon which that information is given, and there's obviously clear contractual and legal terms upon the information to be provided. So when I'm reading through your analysis of this, and throughout it there's a feeling that the Kpmg report, elements of it are reasonable, but also that is based upon the fact that you just haven't had sight of a lot of that information, and I just don't know how it's fair to make that judgment without having full sight of that information, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, and I say all we can try to do is increase the degrees of transparency and scrutiny that we have. Now, obviously, this has significant implications because, it's a UK-wide scheme, and the requirements are to divulge are UK-wide. But certainly, as I said earlier, I would like to think as we develop successor schemes, we can impose as a condition of drawing down funding that there are requirements that they divulge information to either Ofgem, the utility regulator, or ourselves that give us greater insight going forward.
I think that's important. Just one last question, Chair. Page 8, on table 2, it outlines the different bodies and sort of information sources, maybe you would put it that way, and their figures that they came up with. Those KPMG, DECC, which is now BES, DERI, which is now DFE, Professor Hughes, and the Northern Ireland Audit Office. So there's 5 there. Just in relation to the analysis from Professor Hughes, I'm doing a bit more of a research myself. I don't know I would put as much store in terms of the figures that he provides compared to the other providers, because I'm also conscious of his own views in relation to renewable energy. And I think it's important that we take that into account in terms of that being an authoritative information source, and just be interested in yourselves in terms of your views around that particular sort of viewpoint and source that came from Professor Hughes.
Well, I think you will have seen the letter from Russell Smith, the senior partner in KPMG,
yes,
where he addresses the way in which Professor Hughes analysed the scheme, and I think we would probably share most of those concerns. I suppose in summary, Professor Hughes wasn't comparing like with like in terms of Northern Ireland against GB for a start, in terms of our small scale definition of turbine, I think, was 250 kilowatt hours, whereas he was looking at a larger turbine. There's a whole raft of issues, and so on the whole I think I probably would share some of the concerns flagged up in that letter from KPMG about the way in which Professor Hughes benchmarked his analysis, and the fact that he delivered recommendations that probably weren't based on as firm an evidence base as we would like to have seen. And, you know, to produce criticisms of government policy based on presumptions on like-for-like comparison, I do find concerning.
Yeah, because I'm also aware that some of the information was garnered from accounts company's house.
Yep.
And, you know, anyone would know that that is not a snapshot of the business.
And also it doesn't give you the degree of detail that you would need to see, for example, on OPEX and CAPEX and things like that.
So,
I should just point out at this stage, we did offer Kpmg an opportunity to come in front of the committee to clarify their position and address the concerns that were set out in the letter. That opportunity was not taken up. Sorry.
No, it's okay, Chair. I think it's an important point. It's just one last point. The issue, because this your response in the Kpmg report and the other data around it, to me highlights one wider issue. And I think this is the role of the Public Accounts Committee to highlight these issues and to seek redress around it. Is that there's probably two issues. That energy policy is extremely complex, and I think that we've all hopefully got an understanding of that by now. Okay. Another one is because of the level of complexity. And Northern Ireland is a great country. I love it so much, but we're very, very small in the great scheme of things. We've got a population of 1.8 million. So we have a very complex policy area, but we have a very small population. And having the level of technical knowledge around being able to implement energy policy is a challenge there. It's a challenge in so many other policy areas across Northern Ireland. Sometimes we don't fully acknowledge that. And so as a result, there is an over-reliance upon the industry, certain people within the industry, and certain consultants and all the rest of it for advice. And I think we're going to have to take learnings because from this and from previous issues, but how to address that. Because if we're going to conclude this inquiry, I'm not walking away from this inquiry with a great level of confidence that we're addressing that fundamental issue, which is and I do take comfort from the real efforts the department have made to try to increase that level of knowledge around a very complex area, and I thank you for that. But the issue in terms of the over-reliance upon the industry and that level of trust, because it only takes one or two actions to erode that trust, and as a result, it's government that feels the consequences of that. So I don't know whether you have anything more to say about that, but I think this is a fundamental issue.
Okay, I'll just two very quick high-level observations and maybe bring in Richard. So the first one is in relation to energy strategy going forward. Obviously, the department has now got its energy strategy out to consultation, and it seems to have landed warmly with all key stakeholders. And part of the reason for that, I think, is it's not really just a DFE energy strategy anymore. It's not even just an NICS department, and the department's now more joined up than was ever the case in energy policy before. But we have, you know, external panels of experts, and we've got external stakeholders. So it's a shared energy strategy going forward. But there is a concern there, and you've touched on it, which is, you know, Northern Ireland's a small place to construct energy policy in a devolved context. And if you look at Richard and his team, I think you have what, maybe 100, 150 staff in your team. And yet you look at energy policy at a UK level administered by BES, where they probably have thousands taking it forward. And yet in many ways, energy policy in Northern Ireland is much more complex. You know, for example, in terms of integration of the single electricity market, the fact that some is reserved and some is devolved. So it's an incredibly complex policy environment to look after. So I do worry at times about there needs to be an awareness that DFE cannot own energy strategy going forward in isolation. All the key stakeholders have to buy into it, but even then there has to be a recognition that sometimes some of the issues are just too big to be dealt with at a devolved level, and they should be looked at a reserve level. And sure, Richard, maybe.
And I would agree with the remarks you made. I mean, we are small and we have to learn from what is happening elsewhere across the islands as a whole, but it is also an opportunity. We have to be able to work and bring the network monopolies, whether it's NIE, SONI or the gas companies, to account, and that's the job that the utility regulator does under the regulations and under the statute. But it provides the opportunity, and what we have achieved in renewable electricity in getting to the 49% means that it has been achieved because the electricity company is doing things that aren't being done elsewhere, better than has been done across the rest of the UK, and therefore we have the opportunity to demonstrate. We can do stuff and we can test stuff. And so, for example, recently the first production of green hydrogen across the islands through the electrolyser from what otherwise would have been curtailed renewable wind is an exciting step forward. But the point you make is really well made. We are now firmly engaged with BES in terms of the development of policy, and they're looking to us because of the things that we're achieving. So it's a good two-way conversation.
Thank you, Chair. And I think this is highlighted in other reports we've done about capacity and capability of civil service, about that relationship with what you would describe, Chair, as the imperial civil service. That it's about that relationship in terms of skills, and I think it's an important issue to highlight.
I would, because that's what it is, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Harvey.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just in terms of costs, I was just looking at it and thinking, an insurance cost, would you say the figure quoted has turned out to be accurate, or what thoughts be?
These are the costs quoted for the OPEX estimates. They seem reasonable to us. There's 3 sets of costs. There was the rates, insurance and maintenance, so there's no reason to question it. I think, Trevor, a number of sources were looked at when the benchmarking was being done.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to actually verify the cost, because the stations vary in many ways, in size and where they are and so forth. But I suppose the thing is the estimate that was provided to us by Kpmg was based on actual costs. That was provided to them by 134 different stations. So, from that perspective, it seems like a reasonable sort of representation of the sector.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Beggs.
You say that you believe the costs are a reasonable representation of the sector. I don't know. Were they randomly selected? We're told that, or not. We were told that some provided figures for all their turbines, some provided some information, and some provided none. So how do you know it's reasonable or not? Would it not have been better if there were some mechanism of having random information gathered independently?
Well, the costs identified for insurance, at £2,900 by Kpmg, and for some turbines it'll be higher, for other turbines it'll be lower. All we can really do is...
What was the average size of turbine?
I don't know what the average was.
225 kilowatts.
Yeah, and what you're telling us, 3,000 could be a higher cost or a lower cost. Is that an average cost?
It is for the information identified as part of the sampling exercise. So,
and did you try to do any independent collaboration or confirmation of that? I mean, there are turbines on the public estate. I know, for instance, Antrim Hospital has a turbine. I don't know what size it is, but have you attempted to find out independently what insurance costs might be?
I'm not aware that the steering group did do that.
Okay. In terms obviously, if the owner of the land owned the turbine, there's no rental cost. I know agricultural costs, maybe 300 or 400.
Mr. Beggs, you seem to be losing you, and you're dropping in. Mr. Beggs,
yes,
Mr. Beggs, we seem to be losing you. In fact, we've lost you at the moment, and you're dropping in and out. So there's no flow to your questions. In fact, those of us old enough to remember, you're doing a very good impersonation of Norman Collier. So could I ask you to re-ask the question, if you don't mind?
I'm trying to ascertain. I come back in again.
Okay, that's fine. So whilst Mr. Beggs tries to re-establish the linkage, any other member want to ask a question? Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Chair. It's quite a muddy situation for us in the nicest possible way. We have the audit office saying one thing, independent consultants on behalf of the trade body saying another, and yourselves largely endorsing what the trade body is saying by their consultants. In saying that you think your internal analysis of the Kpmg report is that you think the assumptions in the Kpmg report are broadly defensible or reasonable, implicitly in that, are you disagreeing with the findings or some of the key findings of the Audit Office?
No, we're looking at different data sets. So we're looking at different information. So on the point on rate of return, I think since our last session on the 18th of March, we've had some clarification as to how the Audit Office calculated its rates of return, for example. And I think, Trevor, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was based on 10 turbines, but the cost of one turbine were focused on. Okay, so if you look at that one specific turbine, you will come up with an assessment of what a rate of return is. The Kpmg work and looked at something different, looked at a wider sample and came up with different figures. But there are always assumptions made in how you calculate a rate of return. So, for example, if you looked at the Kpmg report, there were, I think, about 25 or 30 turbines were excluded on the capex side because their capex costs, they were new turbines. Okay, so the capex cost of buying a new turbine was higher, and if you build in higher capex costs for those turbines, then you actually start to reduce the rate of return. So there were adjustments made on, for example, the Kpmg calculations, their methodology, to try and come up with a reasonable assessment of what a rate of return would be, and the Audit Office have done the same. But you say they're looking at different data sets, and this goes to the point that was made earlier, unless you have access to 100% of the data on the OPEX and the CAPEX side and the invoices, you're not going to get the position where both of us agree on an exact number.
Did you want to come in there?
No, that was exactly the point, the final point, yeah.
But in saying that the two major actors, I don't know whether to call them antagonists, the NIAO and Kpmg are looking differently, you are what you're saying is you're not disagreeing with some of the major findings that the Audit Office have made or recommendations, but presumably you don't completely stand over everything they've said and everything in terms of questions they've raised about the efficacy of the NIRO scheme.
No, I can understand exactly how the Audit Office calculated their rate of return, okay, and at the same time I can understand exactly how Kpmg calculated their rate of return. All I'm saying is that the additional work done by the Assurance and Risk Committee group, okay, that I referred to earlier, when they looked at it and looked at the benchmarking exercise, they were broadly in the same place as Kpmg. That's not saying that the Audit Office wouldn't be in the same place if we'd given them the same data set.
And just to add, this plays to the recommendation 6 that we've accepted in the Audit Office report, that we will assess the rate of return across the scheme. It's going to be very challenging, back to the point that was made earlier, when we don't have a legal right to access all the individual pieces of data and information.
So though you don't, though you can't endorse the exact methodology because there is an honest disagreement over data sets being used and assumptions being relied upon, you don't fundamentally disagree with the recommendations in the Audit Office report?
No, because as Richard said, looking forward, we want to get to a place where we can all agree that there's complete transparency on cost data and therefore clear view on what a rate of return, an appropriate rate of return should be.
You said, Mike, in your previous answer that some of the issues in relation to energy policy were too big. Mm-hmm. Do you mean too big for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to, obviously you've been through, well not you specifically, but the entire Northern Ireland Civil Service, and specifically what was DETI, now if you've been through the RHI experience, are you alluding to that experience? Do you think is it simply, are some of the questions simply too big in terms of our size and the civil service capacity?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is that if you look at the energy agenda that lies ahead in terms of growing the green economy and decarbonisation, some of the policy initiatives that you might want to take forward there are so big and complex. I'm not sure that they can be delivered efficiently at a Northern Ireland level. But then again, we're looking at the renewables obligation here, which was a UK-wide initiative, but I think there are probably issues that we would struggle to operate solely on the basis of Northern Ireland Civil Service taking forward major policy interventions if they're complex in the energy space.
But as you say, this wasn't, in a sense, the decision here, scheme wasn't really designed in Northern Ireland. It was, broadly speaking, a lift and lay from Whitehall, but with decisions made at particular points to diverge in a way that was, for better or worse, advantageous perhaps to the small scale sector relative to GB. The exact quantum is obviously debated, but in a sense, this experience wasn't about not having the capacity or the data set to design a local scheme. It was about it, lifting the experience of lifting and laying it or adapting it from Whitehall. Yeah,
the complications arose. So obviously, when decisions are taken in London to change the policy, so for example, the introduction of FIT, for example, that has impacts in Northern Ireland, then policy in Northern Ireland has to react to that in a way that suits whatever the industry requirements are and the sector's requirements are in Northern Ireland. So steady as it was, and then at that time had to react to developments at a UK-wide level in terms of changing policy.
There's one final question here. Just on one of the questions raised by the Audit Office report is about the fact that the cost of Naira was largely, and correct me if I'm, this is obviously a broad statement, largely borne back. It was spread throughout Britain basically, and because of that, I guess, pooling exercise, it was obviously it didn't come out of spending. It wasn't out of current. It wasn't public money. It was public money, but it was consumer money. I suppose it was on bills. Is that? I mean, so there's a question about whether that's value for money, but value for money writ large, as in value for money for people who are paying tax bills in Leicestershire or Angus. Is that, as a accounting officer for DFE, is that something, when you're looking at a value for money, is that something that you look at as well, as in the overall value for money, even if the cost is spread to consumers in Britain? Is that relevant to you in terms of being an accounting officer in the way that managing public money that comes from the block grant is relevant? I don't know if that question makes sense.
It does. So any assessment of value for money will take into consideration the wider social costs and benefits that accrue from that. So, for example, the needs, for example, in the Northern Ireland context, whether it be rural diversification or the fact that we have greater preponderance of wind, all those things feature into how Northern Ireland might benefit from it. But the actual implications in the wider GB context would be a consideration in that decision-making process. But the bottom line in a sort of value for money context is, as Richard's point earlier, it's got Northern Ireland in a position where we are at 49% of electricity generated comes from wind locally. Okay, and in terms of the cost to the consumer, I think this is the figure is something like 1p per turbine over 20 years. It's the figure that always jumps out at me to get to that 49% of electricity generated here being renewable.
And just a couple of important points. There's two sides to this obligation. The UK government decided to put less of an obligation on Northern Ireland electricity suppliers to reflect the fuel poverty position relative to GB, because we had to pay more for our fuel here. So that was a UK-wide policy decision. The second aspect of that is we have more wind in Northern Ireland than they have in the south of England, so it's natural that we should be producing more wind energy relative to the size of the south of England. And that was the way the UK-wide policy was designed.
Okay, thank you. No other members seem they want to ask questions, and Mr. Beggs has been unable to rejoin the meeting. Mr. Donnelly, have you any comments or questions?
No, just welcome a couple of points made.
Okay.
The accounting officer basically going forward that we'll have not just a Department of Economy policy, but a civil service wide, and also that commitment in any new schemes that we at the design stage we get access into costing information. I think that's the key point. When we're working on limited information on cost, it's very hard to bolt the thing down, and it'll depend on what assumptions are made. So I think there's certainly learning for any future schemes.
Okay. Mr. Stevenson, any comment you want to make at this stage?
Nothing further from my perspective, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Brennan, Mr. Rogers, Mr. McBride, thank you very much for attending
I
the
have one very
committee.
brief question, if I may. It will be very brief.
Well,
If
well,
it will, I
no
promise.
monologues, brief
I
questions.
promise it will not be very. I'll simply preface it by saying some of us are hoping to go to Donegal this summer. What will be the status of the biogas plant in Donegal if we encounter it? Is it
Still operating and still burning chicken waste from Northern Ireland.
okay? That's all I wanted. Thank you.
Take a note of that. That's a history-making moment.
What's that?
History-making moment.
a trail to go to the. I can't wait. Go and see it.
Okay, so thank you very much, gentlemen. And so, members, again, we'll have to take a short break. We will remain in open session for agenda item 8 to consider the delays in ministerial directions. Mr. Brennan will remain at the table and will be joined by Mr. Colin Woods, Director of Corporate Governance, and will join to discuss the delay in ministerial directions when we move to agenda item 8 in just a few moments' time.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound.
Okay, order. Okay, members, we move then to agenda item 8, delays in ministerial directions. Mr. Mike Brennan, the Accounting Officer, Department of the Economy, and Mr. Colin Woods, Director of Corporate Governance, have now joined the meeting. And members, I welcome Mr. Brennan and Mr. Woods to the meeting, and we're delighted to have with us again for the continuation of the meeting Mr. Donnelly, the Controller and Auditor General, and Mr. Stuart Stevenson, of the Officer of Accounts at the Department of Finance. The updated list of ministerial directions is pages 174 to 176 of your pack, and the list is coded green, amber and red, showing ministerial directions completed, potentially delayed and delayed. Mr. Brennan, I invite you to make an opening statement, and then, of course, then we'll ask the committee for any comment or question.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just a few initial comments to set the context. 15 ministerial directions from the department in the space of a year is completely and utterly unprecedented. As you know, there were 4 ministerial directions in the previous 11 years combined. So we found ourselves over the last year or so in just incredibly difficult waters. the context around the pandemic and trying to get all our staff working from home created an environment of confusion and chaos. The clear political requirement was to support as many businesses in Northern Ireland as possible, as quickly as possible. And that put a lot of pressure on DFE staff to try and construct schemes at very short notice and get them operationalised. So, as I say, there were 15 directions in the last financial year. 14 of them related to COVID interventions, and the other was in relation to the public service obligation to keep the City of Derry Airport going. I have to say and apologise for the fact that we didn't get the ministerial directions. In most cases we did get them to the CNIG in a reasonable period of time, but in some cases we did not. And that, to be honest, I'm sorry, it's just a reflection of the chaos that we found ourselves in. And I know two in particular, the bed and breakfast scheme and the CRBSS scheme. The delays there, 55 days and 87 days, were unacceptable. Colin has now, in his corporate governance role, put in place mechanisms to centralise the ministerial direction process in the department. And since that's happened, we've had 3 ministerial directions, I think, in this year so far, and the average time it's taken to get those to the CNIG was 9 days on average. Okay, but as I can just apologise that in some cases on those 15 there were delays. It was down to the fact that, particularly around the November 2020 time, it was a state of chaos because the executive on real-time basis was changing information that we were giving to them. So, for example, we would construct a scheme, the paper would go into the executive, discussions would happen in the executive, and then we would find ourselves in a completely different position at the end of the executive meeting. We also had complications around difficult to understand how changes in the health regulations would impact on how we might take a scheme forward. So, for example, we didn't know what sectors of the economy were going to be closed down until the executive had formed a view on health regulations. So then we had to go back and revisit our paper. So it was quite chaotic. And as I say, that was 1 week in particular in November, where a small group of staff in a particular division were actually running a number of these grant schemes at the same time. So it's difficult to understand what the executive requirement was. And as I say, some of the discussions were at the political level. So there was an incorrect notification went to the audit office. That was because we didn't actually realise that the finance minister and the economy minister had agreed on an extension of the scheme in the executive. So what we had put forward as ministerial direction was no longer required. So all I can do is apologise for the fact that there was that degree of confusion on our part. But Colin, do you maybe want to say something about how we've centralised the process within the department?
Sure. So what we've done is we have inserted my own team in the middle of that process at the key steps, in a formal role as opposed to in our advisory role that we would have had before, so that all ministerial directions get formal sign-off from Corporate Governance Division, and that allows us to see and be well sighted on who are the officials dealing with it, and to make sure that they're carrying out their responsibilities for onward notification once a direction has been given and approved. And as Mike has said, that is working well so far this year.
I think you'll find the committee's not unsympathetic. You'll remember that last year, whenever we were at the height of the COVID pandemic and the pressures on the civil service, we did agree in this committee to suspend our work, so rather than have permanent secretaries, including yourself, come in front of the committee, and the preparation and time that was being taken to do that, knowing and understanding, appreciating the pressures that there were on you and your colleagues in terms of dealing with COVID and the pressures on the economy and schemes to keep businesses afloat and very doors of those businesses open. So we're not unsympathetic to the point you're making. I haven't had any member who's indicated that they want it. Mr. Muir?
Matthews.
Right.
Yeah, look, I appreciate this. I think a lot of your staff, well, if not the majority of your staff, are all working from home as well. So there's challenges around that, and I think we're starting to see that when people are starting to come back into the workplace, the benefits of that compared to working from home and all the rest of it. So I think it's just learnings as we move forward. I'm very much a person who's focused about what's the problem, how do we solve it, and how do we move forward. Far too much in Northern Ireland we just linger on the problem. Just in relation to the High Street stimulus scheme, to me that stands out as one of the most unique ministerial directions. yeah, I would say it's fair. It's probably the most unique ministerial direction I've seen in my time, and particularly through this pandemic. There's another one which was we were touching upon earlier, which is the Loch Ness support scheme around that. But my understanding is that that ministerial direction is for the principle of the scheme rather than for the detail of it. I just wanted to get that confirmation from yourself and why you felt you needed to get a ministerial direction about the principle of the scheme, never mind the details of it.
It is an incredibly complex scheme, and there was no time to engage in what I would call due process. So, for example, the executive agreed that a scheme had to be put in place. If you were to do this in a normal course of events, you would go through the construct of a normal business case and an economic appraisal. You would form a view on whether it represented value for money and whether it was affordable, and then you would carry out the sort of statutory consultation processes. So that's quite a rather lengthy process, and the executive agreed that there wasn't time to do that. So that's why we needed a ministerial direction to take forward the process of actually putting a scheme in place.
Okay. There's very clear value for money considerations around that scheme, because a lot of these schemes were brought forward because the permanent secretary couldn't be satisfied in relation to value for money. Now, in many examples for ourselves and for the general public, it's very clear that there is value for money around that, but there has been a process and an ability to do the economic appraisal and the business case processes around that. So, for example, one of the cases to me, which is very clear why it should have occurred, and I fully support for their ambulance, for example, but that wasn't able to go through that process. But in relation to this high street stimulus scheme, there is, a very significant value for money in terms of the scheme, and the value for money, in terms of the distribution. There's no distinction made in terms of who will receive it and who won't receive it. And just have an update just in relation to whereabouts the further ministerial direction is in relation to that, and whenabouts we'll get sight of that.
Well, it is a very, very blunt policy intervention to give 1.4 million people, adults, £100 each to spend, and the strong recommendation was that the best time, the time where you generate greatest positive impact in terms of spend was to try and engineer it around September, October time. The retail sector thought that was when it was most beneficial, which is why we're trying to move things forward as urgently as possible in terms of the procurement process. What I would say in this open format is that it's an incredibly complex process, and not without difficulties, and that we are liaising closely with Minister, the Executive and the Economy Committee on where this goes. But, put it like this, if we were to go through the normal process of business case and approvals without a ministerial direction, I would doubt that we would have a scheme approved by the autumn, never mind procured and delivered by the autumn.
Okay, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. And again, we all acknowledge the extraordinary pressure departments, and especially yours, because you're in the front line of a lot of these things. I just want to understand the process that should have happened and didn't happen in terms of ministerial directions. Is it the case that when a policy team that is responsible for designing and providing advice on a particular, like say for the sake of the bed and breakfast guest house support scheme, there was one of the largest delays in notification. Do they send? Will they send the design of the policy scheme to the Permanent Secretary's office, and the US accounting officer will have to say? Will they give you a recommendation as to whether a direction will be needed, or do you get it as a matter of course and then take that decision yourself? Obviously, you take that decision yourself, you're the accounting officer, but at where's the decision point originated, if you see what I mean?
Well, I'll bring Colin in a second, but two issues to flag up. So the bed and breakfast scheme was largely driven by our tourism folk who would have no experience really in a ministerial direction.
Yeah.
Okay, so they wouldn't be aware of the process, but they'd be aware that they couldn't do the normal value for money judgments or affordability judgments in terms of a business case. They'd be aware that a ministerial direction was needed. So the proposals are put to me, and I realise that as an accounting officer, I can't stand over this and validate a request. The only way spend can happen is through ministerial direction, which is why the minister then takes it to the executive to be endorsed. So there's an issue around awareness and experience of the individuals constructing it.
Yeah.
But then, as I say, it all fed into that disjoint because at that stage it wasn't joined up with the corporate governance side on Collins, who knew the process that should be in place and could take it through to where the private office. So basically we weren't as joined up at that stage as we should have been in terms of internal communications and what a ministerial direction actually meant. Colin, do you maybe want to elaborate?
Yeah, so as they use the phrase in normal times, but in normal times when a direction might be contemplated, you typically would have had a prolonged period of discussion between officials and minister developing the policy and the broad intent. And in those circumstances, there would be plenty of time for, first of all, for the normal value for money considerations to be done, because our objective would always be to be able to present minister with value for money options that are compliant with managing public money in full. But with the pace of COVID interventions in particular, knowing that Mike and the Minister were having regular discussions about how things were developing and likely timelines. Generally, for these cases, we would arrive at the point of the scheme design, knowing that there wasn't going to be time to do those normal business cases and so on, and therefore knowing that the only way this was ever going to go through in the time frame envisaged was via a direction. So it wasn't the normal to and fro and exchange of views in that sense.
Almost assumed at the beginning that a direction was going to have to be issued because this was happening so quickly.
Yes.
But there should have been a point of communication from the Permanent Secretary's Office or corporate governance to, would that have been to say it's now my responsibility to, obviously there's an exchange of letters between yourself and the Minister, but then there should also have been a moment which is, right, now the next part is we need to write a letter to CNAG, but also I think the Department of Finance.
Yeah, so
did that happen, or was it just the CNAG who was?
Yeah, so the direction has to be approved either by the Minister of Finance or the Executive, and that was done in every case. And then after that, once it's all through and approved, that's the point at which we're required to notify the CNAG.
And that's what we
it was that point where some officials weren't just as familiar with the process and omitted to check, and we didn't have sufficient visibility to pick those up in time.
So is the thing that will happen now that there's a filtration process that where corporate governance will say, well, a quality control thing will happen where as at some point in the process, as at the beginning of the process or the end, where you say, remember, this has to be notified?
Yeah, exactly. So that the responsibility for doing that in the guidance that existed at the time lay with the business areas. But as Mike has said, not everybody was familiar with that. Directions are certainly were a fairly uncommon thing, and people may not have had cause to be familiar with that guidance in advance. Not to say it should still have happened, obviously.
Okay. Can I just ask, to go back to the stimulus, the high street voucher stimulus scheme? Are you, now that you've got, so there's an initial relatively, obviously lots of directions, the volume is unusual, but as Andrew Muir said, the nature of the direction sought for a high street voucher scheme was in itself relatively unusual because it was a relatively early stage of the process. Are you, is your belief that it will kind of cover you for the rest of the process, or do you anticipate needing a further direction? Not, you might, but is there a world in which you may need a further direction?
There are a couple of scenarios that may see further ministerial directions needed. I'm treading delicately here, Chair, because there are quite sensitive commercial and legal issues at play.
And don't allow members to push you in there.
Yeah, no, so, but I can see scenarios where that may be the case.
Fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Beggs.
Just to follow up the issue of the speed of design of these schemes and how busy everybody was in developing them, and that the notification process was overlooked. Mr. Brennan, these are multi-million pound schemes. Are you not aware, or do your staff not advise you of multi-million pound schemes that are progressing?
That wasn't the issue at play here. So, as we've just discussed, the process in terms of the scheme being constructed, agreed in the executive, the minister asking for the executive's endorsement or the finance minister's endorsement, all those steps were adhered to. So I was fully aware of the construct of the scheme. I was fully aware of how the scheme was being presented to the executive and what the executive was agreeing to. Where we went wrong was after the executive had agreed the scheme, so therefore after they had agreed the financial allocations to the scheme, where we went wrong, or rather where we weren't as speedy as we should have been, was, and then it was the final step, which was formally notifying the CNAG. So the issue about knowing about the cost wasn't an issue.
Okay, so they're actually approved at the executive level rather than departmental levels. Should it not then have fallen on the executive office permanent secretary to notify CNAG?
No, because it's the relevant departmental accounting officer that submits the ministerial direction. So in DFE's case, there were 15 ministerial directions in the course of the year that were notified, but there were other departments as well during the course of last year that had schemes. You know, TEO, I think, had one in relation to travel agents. Infrastructure had some, health had some. They all go from the departmental accounting officer. So, you know, the economy minister made 15 ministerial direction requests to either the finance minister or the executive. Similarly, you know, the health minister did the same, the infrastructure minister did the same. It's not for TEO to take ownership of them. Okay, but it was just the fact that they were approved by the executive rather than signed off by the economy minister. That was the point I was trying to highlight. No, and actually the money comes through DFE as a department for these directions, so it's where the money flows through. That's the relevant accounting officer that has to take responsibility. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, members. Mr. Donnelly, have you any comment you want to make?
No, I've nothing to add, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Stevenson, have you any comment you want to make?
Yes, Chair. Just briefly, just wanted to say that the work that's been done on ministerial directions has been very significant in recent months, and some very good collaboration, I think, between ourselves and finance, our colleagues in the audit office and the departments in terms of addressing these issues. And I know we've issued guidance on this piece, which I think has helped. But certainly moving forward, we're continuing to engage with the audit office, and the timely notification. We intend to produce further guidance to push departments in that area. But I think much good work has been done, certainly in the economy department, and the comments of Mr. Brennan and Mr. Woods are very helpful today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brennan, Mr. Woods, that's you finished. Thank you very much, in particular Mr. Brennan, for coming in front of us today.
Thank you.
3 sessions. We very much appreciate
Thank you, Chair.
that. Members, that concludes our evidence session for today. Mr. Stevenson, thank you for attending, and I'm content now you can leave the meeting. Members, we will have another short adjournment to allow the room to be reset for the next item on the agenda. Okay, so we now just go into suspension for a few moments.
Programme signed.
Okay, order. Members, as you'll have seen, the actual chair of the Public Accounts Committee has had to step out, so I'm stepping in. Members, we will now go into open session to consider 4 ministerial directions. Can we please bring in Mr. Neil Gray, Director, Northern Ireland Audit Office? Can you be brought on the spotlight? Hi, Neil. Neil, can I ask you to talk us through the ministerial directions?
Mr. Chairman, just to start with, can I declare an interest in that my dad has about 70 sheep? Say there's a wool producers scheme in discussion.
Okay, do any other members wish to declare an interest or have any other relevant comments to make?
No sheep.
Dairy sheep?
No sheep.
Very good. Neil, can I turn to you to give us a briefing on the ministerial directions in question?
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me okay. You have 4 ministerial directions in front of you from DERA. None of them in themselves are particularly outlandish or unusual. They cover a variety of situations, 2 of which are directly related to COVID, and 2 of which are probably more peripherally related to COVID, but nevertheless COVID has an influence. There's not very much to bring to the committee's attention here that's particularly unusual, but I must highlight that the committee will not have seen the original request from the accounting officer to the minister for the payments in relation to Loch Ney fishermen. The department has considerable sensitivities over the long and tangled legal history as to who's entitled to fish on the loch, and I believe that's what lies behind the department's reluctance to furnish the committee with that letter. Apparently it does contain matters that they would wish to keep under legal privilege.
Okay.
That said, I don't think there's anything more that I need to say. Obviously, I'm quite happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Neil. What I should do, I realise I've omitted to do with the proper procedurals and introduce the agenda item properly, so I will do that now. This is agenda item 9. Neil, thank you for giving us that slightly precipitous intro, helpful though it was. I should have introduced it properly. Members, I refer you to correspondence we've been copied into dated 9th of June 2021 at pages 179 to 180 of your pack from Mr Andy Monaghan, Departmental Assembly Liaison Officer to the Department of Finance, to Mr Peter McCallion, Chair of the Finance Committee, regarding clarity on the list of ministerial directions. Members, Mr Monaghan has highlighted to the Finance Committee that rather than hold up the publication of the ministerial directions, it was decided to publish an interim list in May 2021 which excluded those not yet discussed by the Public Accounts Committee. The full list will be published as soon as this committee has had a chance to discuss those which remain outstanding. Mr Monaghan has also stated that the list will be updated and published on a regular basis. Are we content to note, members?
Yep.
Yes, content. Okay. No dissenting voices. In that case, we will proceed now properly into the discussion of the ministerial directions, which I've already asked Neil to dive into in a slightly improvisational way, but let's do it properly and formally now. Members, I refer you to correspondence from Mr Kieran Donnelly, CB, CNAG, dated 10th of June 2021, and correspondence dated 23rd of April 2021, to the CNAG from Mr Dennis McMahon, Accounting Officer, DERA, at pages 181 to 183 of your table pack. The ministerial direction is to provide short-term support for the impact of COVID-19 on Loch Ney inland fishermen. Members, you should note that the documentation does not include the Permanent Secretary's submission to the DERA Minister. The Department is refusing to submit this to the committee, citing legal privilege. Inland fishermen in Loch Ney incurred losses as a result of not being able to fish due to the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020. Eligibility criteria proposed by DERA officials included the requirement for a DERA licence and a fishing permit or evidence of permission to fish from the fishery owner. The ministerial direction on 27th January 2021 removed the requirement of permission to fish from the fishery owner due to ownership of fishing rights at Loch Ney being a contentious and disputed issue. The Department estimates that the total cost will be £198,000. Members, the relevant papers on the approval of this scheme are at pages 184 to 185 of your pack, and I turn now to the Controller and Auditor General in proper order to ask if he has any comments.
I think you've covered all the points, Chair. There's nothing there I need to add.
Okay, would any members like to make any comment? Andrew Muir.
Thank you, Chair. Just in relation to the funding of the Loch Ney COVID support scheme, it does say that the submission from the Permanent Secretary wasn't included in the committee. It's whether you've had sight of that or whether that wasn't.
No, that's a good question. We haven't had sight of it either. So, and then I'd be the conduit to bring it to you. Yeah.
I can understand the context behind that, but I think for the role of yourself, the CNAG and the Audit Office, to be able to scrutinise what our ministerial directions are meant to be unusual because of the clear circumstances arising from when they're granted. The fact that you're not going to have access to that information to be able to analyse this ministerial direction strikes me as concerning. I understand the issue about legal privilege, but whether why you as CNAG, as a the auditor for Northern Ireland, can't have access to that information?
Over the years, I've seen many documents with legal privilege, but when I do, I would treat them sensitively.
Yes.
So there have been occasions in the past where I would have received probably documentation I wouldn't have fully shared with the committee for that reason. So you raise a good point. So I will push this with the Permanent Secretary. It's more a point of principle.
Yes.
There's no big issue as regards the direction itself. It's almost a bit of subtext. But the last time the committee had an issue like this was on your session on, it was legal opinion on the MOT contract, where again information or documentation wasn't fully shared. Now that legal people take the view that their advice is for the recipient of the advice, but there are occasions when the public interest will trump that. I don't think this is one of those occasions, but nevertheless, it's more a point of principle.
I think maybe an express my own disappointment that this hasn't been shared with the CNAG. I don't know whether we go back to the department and express that as well, but I think this is a point of principle and it's quite important.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, and if it's in order, I would suggest that the chair thinks about writing to the department and express our concern at that, unless members are content with that. Agreed. Any other members want to make any comment about the Loughney direction? Anyone on Starleaf? No. Okay, we'll move on. Members, I refer you to correspondence from Mr. Kieran Donnelly, CB, CNAG, dated 10th of June 2021, and correspondence dated 23rd of April 2021 to the CNAG from Mr. Dennis McMahon at pages 186 to 189 of your table pack. It is a table pack regarding a ministerial direction. The ministerial direction will make payments to CAFRA students to address digital poverty due to COVID-19 disruption. For support payments of £60 will be paid to full-time and part-time higher education, further education students. The estimated total cost is projected to be approximately £100,000. Payments for the scheme are to be met within the departmental COVID-19 budget for 2020-21. The relevant papers make it clear that the Department of Finance Minister approved this proposal on 16th of April and are pages 190 to 192. Does the CNAG have any comments on this?
No, in money terms, this is a relatively small one, but I suppose as the Department of Economy accounting officer said on an earlier one, some of these they're quite blunt instruments. So this is related to digital poverty. It doesn't mean that every student is suffering digital poverty, but in the time available, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to target a scheme at those who might need it most. So I can understand the thinking behind the direction.
Do any members have any comments? I had just one question, which is that this is this unique? I think this is unique to CAFRA students. I don't think further education students generally have received payments of this sort.
Neil, can you have any further information on that? We can check that out, Chair, and come back to you.
Certainly, I'm unaware of any other such payments, CNAG. Okay.
I'm not suggesting that it's the wrong thing to do. It's just an interesting to note that it's obviously a relatively small cohort of people who are students who are affected by this, but it doesn't seem to. It hasn't been matched by other HE, other HE and FE students. Okay, if no other members have comments, I take it we are content on this. So we move on. Members, I refer you to correspondence from Kieran Donnelly, CB CNAG, dated 10th June 2021, and correspondence dated 23rd of April 2021 to the CNAG from Mr Dennis McMahon, Accounting Officer DERA, at pages 193 to 195 of your table pack regarding a ministerial direction. The ministerial direction will make payments under a COVID-19 support for wool producers scheme. Support payments of £1.40 per ewe to be made to farm businesses with I'm not sure whether I should be saying you or yo. I think my grandfather would probably be disappointed in me saying you, but to be made to farm businesses with the department identifying eligible numbers of ewes from the Animal and Public Health Information System. The estimated total cost is projected to be approximately £1.265 million, with eligible farm businesses receiving on average £130. Members' payments for the scheme are to be met within the departmental COVID-19 budget for 2021. The relevant papers make it clear that the Department of Finance Minister approved this proposal on 16 April 2021 and are at pages 196 to 198. Does the CNAG have any comments?
Nothing to add, Chair, on that one.
Okay. Any members like to make a comment at this stage on this direction? No. In that case, members are content. That is good. We now move on to a further direction support scheme for impacted flooding in the Glenelly and Owen-Killoo River catchment areas. Members, I refer you to correspondence from Kieran Donnelly, CB, CNAG, dated 10th of June, 2021, and correspondence dated 23rd of April 2021 from Mr Dennis McMahon, Accounting Officer DERA, at pages 199 to 202 of your table pack regarding a ministerial direction that has been sought. The attached ministerial direction will provide support to farmers under the impact for farmers under the impact of flooding in the Glenelly and Owen-Killoo River catchment areas. Farmers in these areas incurred losses as a result of flood damage in August 2017. A methodology for determining the level of funding per farm business, capped at 106k, is included in the ministerial direction on the 31st of March 2021. The Department estimates that the total cost will be £3.45 million to be met within the 2020-21 budget. Members, the relevant letter makes clear that the Department of Finance Minister approved this proposal on 20th April 21 and are at pages 205 to 207. Does the Comptroller and Auditor General have any comments?
So some of you, Chair, may remember there was very serious flooding in the Glenealy Valley back in 2017. It's quite interesting this is only coming to fruition now, so many years later. But I think it is what it is, and it's compensation for both income forgone and also the need to, I suppose, rebuild fences and bring land back to order. Neil, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Sorry, through the Chair.
Sorry, Mr.
No,
McKee.
it's very straightforward.
Okay, we can go to...
It's a very straightforward case.
Okay, Mr. McHugh.
Yes, through the Chair, Gormagat. Having visited the Glenelly Valley at that time and see the destruction, where it was actually described as a moon landscape by some observers, I would welcome this payment now being made to the residents not in the Glenelly Valley as a result of the Owen-Killoo having caused so much damage, and it is long overdue. So it's a very, very welcome payment to those people in that area.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McHugh. I see Mr. Beggs has his hand up too. Roy, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I too saw the TV reports at that time, considerable boulders and on, I think it was perhaps even silage fields, and there was then discussion over perhaps even getting the waste moved away and the huge costs involved. But my question is, was there any explanation for the huge variety of, the huge difference between the two grants depending on the ground? I'm just trying to understand how those costs came into being.
No, we wouldn't have probed into that level of detail, Mr. Beggs, but we're very happy to look further into it. At this stage, I suppose we're just notifying you of the direction. We can drill further in when we do the audit.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Beggs. I had a question which is simply, do we know why it's taken so long to make this payment. Obviously, we've been going through lots of directions relating to COVID-19, including the previous 3, and so it's, in a set, given that it's the same department.
It's possible with the Assembly being down during the earlier part of the period, it could be an explanation for it. So I'll make inquiries into that as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do any other members have any comments in that direction? In that case, if we are content, we will move on, and we will now go into closed session for the remainder of the meeting. Can we please bring in Mr. Patrick Barr, Director, and Mr. Brian O'Neill, Senior Auditor, Northern Ireland Audit Office?
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound.